Please join with me for a moment of prayer. Gracious and loving God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of our hearts, and indeed the actions of our lives always be acceptable to you, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So in the fall of 2016, after 5 years of ministry, I qualified for a 3-month-long sabbatical and took the opportunity to take a trip around the world. The adventure began, of course, with a flight, which took me to Iceland, where I spent 5 days, then was on to Paris for 24 hours, and then the highlight was the 800-kilometer hike across Spain known as the Camino de Santiago. I went for some respite in Barcelona after that. Then I was on to Scotland to visit Glasgow and Edinburgh, and spend a week on the Isle of Iona at a famous retreat center that was on the location of a monastery originally built in 563 AD by St. Columba. This building you see here was built in 1300 AD, and it's where I slept for that week as I took a course on pilgrimages for 7 days. Then I was on to jolly old England, and then I flew to Southeast Asia and met my mother in Thailand, where we toured around Thailand, Laos. We took a slow boat down the Mekong River, visited Cambodia and Angkor Wat, and then finally Vietnam. And it was back across the Pacific Ocean, quite literally going around the world in 80 days on the theme of pilgrimage. Now, the word Camino means a journey, a path, or a way. And so the Camino de Santiago is the way of St. James to the city of Santiago de Compostela. You see there on the far left. It is in northwestern Spain, and it is believed to be the burial place of St. Iago, St. James, one of the 12 disciples. And it is believed he traveled there after the death and resurrection of Jesus. Another one of the 12 disciples, Thomas, is believed to have gone in the other direction to India. But in the medieval ages, in about the 9th century, the body of St. James, St. Iago, was found in a field. And since that time, pilgrims have journeyed to see St. James's remains. It was a practice that fell away after the Enlightenment, but in the last 40 years, it's really grown in popularity. And now, about 350,000 pilgrims walk at least part of the Camino de Santiago every year, and I did the red part there across Spain. Now, you've probably heard it said that life is a journey, and here's a note I made to myself the night before I departed in the town of Saint-Jean-Pied-du-Port. So why did I embark on this journey? Well, if you stay still for too long, you stop growing as a person and you start to grow moss instead, and that is a point of a sabbatical. The idea that sometimes you need to leave the comfort of home and go somewhere uncomfortable instead. This is what one of the dormitories in the auberges, the hostels we stayed in, were extremely uncomfortable, and I can't tell you how noisy it is to share a room with 25 or so pilgrims who've walked 20 to 40 kilometers every day and snoring like there is no tomorrow. So through that discomfort and through the adventure and all that, you end up stretching yourself. You learn and grow as a person by setting forth on an epic journey to explore strange new worlds. Here's a picture of the world on a hillside. But you won't be alone on this journey, because you will encounter God. And Jesus will show up in the faces of strangers, and the Spirit will be stirring up all kinds of things within you. Just like in today's scripture from Luke chapter 24. Now, that same day, 2 of them were going to the village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and they were talking to each other about everything that had happened. And as they discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. And you will make great friends, like this woman, Jane, from Nova Scotia. On the first night of the Camino, before we even departed in the auberge, they had dinner for all of us, and we played get to know you games, and I sat down beside Jane. And when it came time for us all to share why we were doing the Camino, I said I was doing it to stretch myself. I was too ashamed to admit that I was a clergy person, I say as I put on my clergy collar. And at the end, Jane leaned over to me and said, "Jeff, did you notice nobody said they were doing the Camino for religious reasons?" And I said, "Well, truth be told, Jane, I'm actually a minister myself." And she said, "Oh, I go to a United Church in Nova Scotia. And we ended up having this really deep, almost hour-long conversation about faith and life. And we made the decision that we would start the Camino the next morning together. But she was too slow. So after about 15 minutes, I had to say goodbye, and I've never seen Jane again. But we are friends on Facebook. But you'll make new friends. By the third day, I noticed some people who were going about the same pace as me, and they invited me to have dinner with them. And Brenda here on the left and Maddie up on the top and Steve on the right there became my hiking companions for the next 2 weeks. We spent all day, every day, and every night together as our Camino friendship grew. And Madeline and I ended up walking the whole way together, in fact. And we made other friends, horses and cows and dogs and these cats who one morning as I woke up in the dark desperately wanted some of the vending machine potato chips I had bought. And yes, I confess that's what I had for breakfast that day. But the journey really is all about meaning making. And so there's some beautiful graffiti along the way. Your feet will heal, but the friends you make will be a lifetime. And speaking of feet, here's what my feet look like in Saint-Jean right before leaving on the Camino. And close your eyes if you are squeamish, but here's how they looked halfway through with blisters and calluses. And this is them on the last day when I arrived in Santiago. And by the way, I had fewer blisters than anybody I knew on the Camino. So of course, when my mom and I arrived in Thailand, we went for pedicures, as one does. So no, the journey of life ain't easy, and neither is the Camino. There's lots of blood, sweat, and even tears. And here's a video of me on the first day of the Camino going up the Pyrenees Mountains. And yes, that is sweat, quite literally dripping off my nose with every breath. But the thing you discover on the Camino de Santiago is that putting in all that effort is really worth it, because that's how you get the best view. And sometimes on the journey of life and on the Camino, there's a lot of poop. In fact, I ended up getting really quite sick on the Camino, sick to my stomach, and almost ended up in hospital with dehydration. And that was not fun. In 40 degrees Celsius weather, carrying a 30-pound pack and walking 25 or 30 kilometers every day. And there were plagues like these flies. At one point in time, we had a plague of locusts. And yes, even bed bugs. One day after walking 35 kilometers, we came into a town with only one albergue, a brand new one. And when we went to make our beds, there was a bed bug. I managed to capture it, but there was nowhere else to stay. And so 4 hours later, the welts started to show up and we had to unpack our bags and found a few who were hitchhiking with us. And the perils on the journey, like the running of the bulls in Pamplona, or the time I went for a bio break and my leg hair got filled with burrs that took a half an hour to pick out. It's always make the best stories, the challenges. But don't worry, there is always a way. And even the worst meals, like the one on the left there, which was the dinner the first night in Roncesvalles, a small town of 50 people with only one restaurant, a whole fish and some soggy potato chips, or this one on the right here, which is the local delicacy in the town of Astorga, meat prepared 12 ways, which didn't taste so great. Those terrible meals made great stories, but you could always wash them down with wine. There on the left is a free wine fountain for pilgrims, and there's grapes that you could glean from the fields along the way too. Sometimes there was even a little too much wine. This was after a whole lot of paella at one place in Hospital de Ortega. And there's a vegetarian meal on the left, pizza on the right. And of course, in Spain, you get to have tapas. But the best meals were the ones we made ourselves. One of us would go into a bakery, another one would go to the butchery, another one would go to the fromagerie, and we would throw it all together and call that lunch. Or one day, Maddie and I couldn't find a restaurant that was open on a Sunday evening, so we made our own pasta. And this was the best meal of the trip, the one Maddie and I had just before we said goodbye forever, a little potluck on the ocean side with cava, which is Spanish champagne. And even along the journey, there were stands like this fresh fruit stand, which was free. A young Canadian woman fell in love with a Spanish guy on the Camino and decided to stay and give free fruit juice to pilgrims. And that all provided fuel to climb the mountains. And boy, were there mountains. 4 mountain ranges, in fact, that we crossed. Sometimes through fog, and that is smoke from forest fires. But the 4th mountain range, we went to a mountain called the Mountain of Pain. And this is a sign to that albergue 1.5 kilometers ahead where the bed bugs were atop the Mountain of Pain. But the higher you go, of course, the better the view. And on the top of the Pyrenees, we discovered the Fountain of Rolland. Now, Rolland was the captain of the rear guard in Charlemagne's army, who conquered the Iberian Peninsula in the 800s, in the 8th century. And that story of Charlemagne's conquest was written in the 11th century French epic poem, Le Chanson de Rolland, which is considered the oldest piece of French literature in the world. And we studied it in seminary, and here I was at the very Fountain of Rolland, spending the night in Roncesvalles where the great battle of Charlemagne happened. Now, here's another mountain story. On the 4th morning, we woke up, as you always do, before 6 a.m. to get on the road before sunrise. And there's Pamplona in the background, and you start climbing because it is just too hot. After noon, it gets to be over 40 degrees Celsius. So you put on a light, you brush your teeth, you don't even shower because you don't want your feet to be wet or soft, and you get going. And as we climbed the 2nd mountain range up Mount Perdon, the sun crested. And Brenda and Maddie and Steve and I had this moment of absolute elation as the sun rose beside us. We started to laugh and to cry, and it was as if God's self was with us. And we spent an hour on top of that mountain, taking pictures and laughing and crying. Strangers just the night before, we now were the closest of friends and spent the next 2 weeks hiking together, and Maddie and I spent the next month together. And here's a sculpture atop the mountain. But the path isn't always mountainous, right? And sometimes it's actually quite plain. And as the word plain indicates, it's plain, very plain. And sometimes it's dreary and dirty and dusty and flat. In fact, the plains can be harder than the mountains. Because on the plains, there's dirt. And the journey isn't always physical. It's a mental struggle too, and a mental journey that can really take its toll. Sometimes you want to give up when the rains come and the winds blow. And in fact, it's in those tough times that you really do encounter God. And you find the strength to keep going. And remember that you're not alone in this journey. But the tough times, they do come to an end. And there are oases and places to soak your feet. There are moments of rest, like this piece of graffiti. Sit here for 3 minutes and clear your mind. Feel the wind move through you, smell the trees around you, be one with nature. This is the essence of something, not the rest of it is worn away. So, walk as if you are kissing the earth with your feet. Of course, that quote from Vietnamese Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh. And slow and steady does it. Like the slug I saw on the first day, or these snails I saw on the last day when I reached the ocean. Keep going, slow and steady, keep swimming. And on the journey, you will meet the strangest people. Like this guy, him and his daughter sat on the side of the Camino with their eagle, raising money for an animal protection agency. You could give a donation and get your picture taken with the bird. And I got my picture taken, and Maddie got her picture taken eventually. But she was so scared of that bird. It took him and I 15 minutes to get Maddie to sit still long enough for him to get a picture with the bird on her arm. And at the end of taking that picture, see that little box there on the table? The gentleman said, "Young lady, look in this box." "No," she said, "I'm not looking at that box. What's in there?" "Everything you ever needed in life is in this box. Open it, young woman." "No, I'm not opening it," Maddie said. There could be a spider in there. What is it?" Well, for a few more minutes, he tried to convince her to open the box, and finally she did. And all that was inside was a mirror and herself staring back at her, everything she ever needed. And as we left this gentleman and his daughter and the eagle outside of the road, Maddie was quiet for at least half an hour, for the first time probably in 3 weeks. And finally she broke the silence and said, "Why do I do that? Why am I filled with so much self-doubt, so much fear?" Because on the Camino, you learn valuable lessons about yourself, and you dig deep. And you find God there sometimes in the depths of your heart. And there were also a lot of sunrises. The really interesting thing about Maddie, who I spent that month with, she was about 8 years younger than me, and she had just finished her Master's of Fine Arts in Photography, where every day for a year, she took a picture of the sunrise. And so on the Camino, she continued that tradition, and every morning as we saw a sunrise, we had to stop, and she took out her black and white Canon camera and took a photo of the sunrise, and I took some with her too. And on that journey, sometimes the path was narrow, whether it was grass or fresh wild dill or ferns. Other times the journey was wide, the road was broad, but it was always well marked with yellow arrows and shells, the symbol of St. James. Sometimes it was crowded. At the end, there were a lot of tourist pilgrims, like this bachelorette party that brought their own jukebox, or this Japanese tour bus. But other times it was desolate, so desolate. Even beside a busy highway, you could feel so alone. This day, we walked up a valley underneath this highway, and it was 47 degrees Celsius, the hottest ever fall in Spanish history. And there were little forest fires and even big forest fires all around us, making terrible air quality. Imagine walking 47 degrees Celsius weather, 30-pound pack on your back, doing 30 to 40 kilometers a day. But there were vineyards too, and medieval villages with cute little churches. There were big cities we passed through as well, like Lyon in this picture, with huge, opulent cathedrals. We went beside still waters. This is the town of Porto Marin. Now, on this day, we had walked 35 kilometers and came to this lackluster town. And I looked at Maddie and said, if we go another 10 kilometers, we can make it to this town called Porto Marin, where there's water. And Porto Marin is interesting because the town used to be right where that water is. They built a dam to make a hydroelectric plant. And so they took the entire city apart brick by brick and rebuilt it up on the mountaintop. But as we crossed this bridge, I saw this piece of graffiti that said, "Go to swim." So you'd better believe that I stripped off my clothes down to my undies, and in that river, I went for a swim as pilgrims on the bridge above hooted and hollered and cheered me on. And everywhere there were symbols of God's love, rainbows, until we finally reached Santiago, our great destination, which was a major disappointment. When we arrived in the town square, there was a basketball tournament.
It is a little bit jarring and strange to be hearing Rihanna in this beautiful plaza after walking 650 kilometers or so. Strange.
Even the pilgrim service at the cathedral was a disappointment. Filled with tourists, they told us they wouldn't swing the giant incense unless people paid enough money. You could hardly get a seat. But it's not about the destination. It was never about Santiago de Compostela. It was about the journey. So we continued on and decided to do another 150 kilometers to the ocean, to Finisterre, which they thought was the end of the world before North America's discovery. This is Finisterre. You can tell why the extra 3 days were worth it. And of course, what did I do when I arrived in the ocean? I went skinny dipping, but I won't leave that picture up for too long. Because Jesus meets us on the journey, not at the destination. And I encountered the divine all along the journey. In the beautiful symbols of stones that say, "I love you," or that people left notes on. This is the Cruz de Ferra. At the halfway mark, there's a giant iron cross. and people bring a stone from wherever in the world they come from and leave it at the base. 350,000 pilgrims a year leave a stone.
From the beach on Berry Island that has walked with me 350 or 400 kilometers or so, not to mention the 10,000 kilometers of air, train, bus travel to get here. And I'm going to leave this at the foot.
There were beautiful crosses where you could have a moment. Places where people left notes of prayer on pieces of paper underneath rocks. There were meditation services. Some of the albergues were run by young volunteers. This was a Christian mission where 18 and 19-year-olds volunteered for the summer to take care of pilgrims and lead worship services in the hostels. Or this Roman Catholic mass I discovered at the top of one of the mountains. So I pulled out my sandwich and had communion with them. By the way, you saw the fog there. Real moments of victory when you get to the top of a mountain and you are exhausted. You know that the effort has been worth it. Even when you get to kilometer 0 at the end of your trail, you find a moment of Zen, a bit of rest. But you realize the journey isn't over. You've just turned the page and a new chapter begins. Remembering that God goes with you in life, in death, and in life beyond death, in the good times and in the bad. We are not alone on the pilgrimage of life. Amen.